The nurse's whisper froze the air in the hospital room. Your father visited him every week. I stared at the man lying in the hospital bed. The fluorescent lights above us hummed softly the way hospital lights always do, but I could barely hear anything over the pounding in my chest. The man's face looked exactly like mine. Same cheekbones, same dark hair, same shape of the eyes. For a long moment I thought maybe I had finally lost my mind. Because 3 hours earlier I had come here furious, ready to confront a stranger who had stolen half my father's life savings. And now I was standing in a hospital room staring at my own face. But that part of the story didn't start here. It started 3 days earlier. My father died on a Tuesday morning. The call came just after dawn while I was still on base in North Carolina. I'm a logistics officer in the Marine Corps, and my mornings usually begin before the sun even thinks about rising. But that morning my phone buzzed on the nightstand with a number from back home in Ohio. I knew before I answered. It was the hospital. The nurse spoke gently the way nurses do when they've had to make this call more times than anyone should. Ms. Mitchell, I'm very sorry. Your father passed away early this morning. Stroke. Quick. Peaceful, she said. I thanked her, hung up, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving. My father, Frank Mitchell, had lived in the same small town outside Dayton for nearly 50 years. He owned a little auto repair shop just off the highway, the kind of place with faded signs and the smell of motor oil soaked deep into the concrete floors. He was the kind of man who fixed things quietly. Engines, neighbors' fences, broken lawnmowers. But he didn't talk much about feelings. That wasn't his style. When my mother left us, walked out when I was 7, he didn't say a bad word about her. Not once. He just worked harder. Long hours at the shop. Nights balancing bills at the kitchen table, Saturdays coaching Little League even though he didn't know much about baseball. He raised me alone. And somehow he managed to send me to college and later watched me join the Marines. The day I graduated from officer training, he stood in the crowd wearing the only suit he owned. I remember the way he shook my hand afterward, firm, proud. Your mother would have been proud, he said. That was my dad, always looking forward, never backward. I took emergency leave and drove the 10 hours back to Ohio. The house looked exactly the same when I pulled into the driveway. The white paint on the porch railings had started peeling again, and the old maple tree in the yard leaned a little farther toward the road than I remembered. Inside, everything smelled faintly like motor oil and coffee. The funeral was small, just a handful of relatives, a few guys from the garage, and some neighbors who'd known my father for decades. People kept saying the same things. Frank was a good man. He helped everybody. Never asked for anything in return. I believed every word of it. Until the will was read. 2 days after the funeral, I sat in a quiet office above the town bank. My father's lawyer, Mr. Callahan, was an older man who had known our family since before I could walk. He adjusted his glasses and opened a manila folder. Your father left very clear instructions, he said. I nodded. I didn't expect surprises. The house would come to me. The garage too, probably. Whatever savings he'd managed to build over the years. But then Mr. Callahan cleared his throat. Half of Mr. Mitchell's estate, he said carefully, is to be transferred to a man named Daniel Carter. For a moment I thought I misheard him. I'm sorry, I said. To who? Daniel Carter. The name meant nothing to me. Who is that? Mr. Callahan looked uncomfortable. Your father didn't specify the relationship. My stomach tightened. That's half his money, I said slowly. Yes. The room felt smaller all of a sudden. My father had worked 50 years for that money. 50. And now half of it was going to a man I had never even heard of. Do you have an address, I asked? Mr. Callahan hesitated before sliding a sheet of paper across the desk. St. Mary's Medical Center, he said. Cleveland. 3 hours away. I didn't say much after that. I drove back to the house, sat at the kitchen table where my father used to sort invoices, and stared at the address for a long time. Anger has a strange way of creeping up on you. At first it's just confusion, then questions, then slowly it becomes something heavier, something sharper. By evening I had convinced myself of one thing. Someone had taken advantage of my father. Maybe he met this man late in life. Maybe the guy told him some sad story. Maybe he manipulated him. But there was no way my father would willingly give half his life savings to a stranger. Not unless someone fooled him. And if someone had done that, I was going to look him in the eye. The next morning, I packed a small bag, grabbed the address, and got in my truck. The drive to Cleveland took about 3 hours. 3 quiet hours where my anger slowly grew. St. Mary's Medical Center stood on a hill overlooking the city, a big brick building with wide glass doors and a parking lot full of cars. I walked inside expecting to meet a con artist. Someone slick. Someone rehearsed. But the receptionist barely glanced up when I said the name. Daniel Carter, she said. Room 412, long-term care wing. Long-term care. That didn't make sense. Still, I took the elevator upstairs. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Nurses moved quietly from room to room. When I reached room 412, the door was slightly open. I pushed it gently. Inside the room, a man lay in the bed. And the moment I saw his face, the world stopped. Because the man staring back at me looked exactly like I did. I stood frozen in the doorway. For a few seconds, my brain simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The man in the bed had my face. Not similar, not close. Exact. The same brow, the same nose my father used to joke about. Even the small scar above the right eyebrow, the one I got falling off my bike when I was 10, seemed mirrored on his face, though his looked older, faded. The only difference was the rest of him. He was thinner, much thinner. His skin had that pale tone people get after spending too many months under hospital lights. Tubes ran from a machine beside the bed, humming quietly. I stepped inside the room slowly. "Hello," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. The man turned his head toward me. His eyes widened slightly, but not in surprise. More like recognition. Then the nurse behind me spoke. "You must be Sarah." I turned. She was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, the kind of nurse who had probably seen more life than most people twice her age. Her badge read, Linda Harper, R.N. "How do you know my name?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she glanced toward the man in the bed. And that's when she said the sentence that had frozen me earlier. "Your father visited him every week." My stomach tightened. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said. Linda shook her head gently. "No," she said, "I don't." She stepped further into the room and closed the door behind her. The man in the bed was still watching me carefully. His voice came out soft. "You're her." "Her? What does that mean?" I asked. Linda pulled a chair closer to the bed and motioned for me to sit. "I think you'd better sit down," she said. I stayed standing. "I'm fine." She sighed the way nurses do when patients insist they're fine but clearly aren't. "Your name is Sarah Mitchell," she said calmly. "Yes." "You grew up in Brookfield, Ohio." I nodded slowly. "Your father was Frank Mitchell." Now my voice hardened. "Was." Linda folded her hands. "Frank came here every Saturday morning for 40 years. 40 years. The number hung in the air. "That's impossible," I said. "I would know." Linda looked toward the man in the bed again. "Daniel," she said gently. "Do you want to tell her?" "Daniel." So that was the stranger's name. But the will had said Daniel Carter. Daniel Mitchell shifted slightly against the pillows. He studied my face the way someone studies a photograph from long ago. Then he gave a faint smile. "You look just like Dad," he said. The room suddenly felt too small. "Okay," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "Somebody needs to start explaining things." Linda walked over to a cabinet beside the bed and opened the top drawer. Inside were envelopes. Dozens of them. Neatly stacked. All addressed in handwriting I knew better than my own. "My father's." She pulled one out and handed it to me. My hands felt strangely heavy as I took it. On the front of the envelope, written in my father's careful block letters, were 3 words. "For Sarah." But the envelope had never been opened. "There are 37 of them," Linda said quietly. "One for every year he visited after your 18th birthday." I stared at the envelope. "Why are they here?" "Because your father asked us to keep them." "Why?" Linda hesitated. "Because he wasn't sure how you'd react." My jaw tightened. "React to what?" Daniel spoke again. "You didn't know about me." It wasn't a question. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "Clearly I didn't." He looked down at his hands. They trembled slightly. Linda pulled another chair closer and finally I sat. Not because I wanted to. Because my legs suddenly felt unreliable. "Your father made us promise something," Linda said. What? That we wouldn't tell you about Daniel unless you came looking. I laughed once. It wasn't a happy sound. Well, congratulations, I said. Here I am. Daniel watched me carefully. You're angry. You think. Linda spoke gently. Sarah, there's something you need to understand. I looked up. What? Your father loved you very much. Something in my chest twisted. I know that. He talked about you constantly. Daniel nodded. Every week. I rubbed my face. Then why did he give half his money to someone he never even told me about? Linda met my eyes. He didn't give it to a stranger. The silence stretched. I could hear the slow rhythm of the heart monitor beside the bed. Beep, beep, beep. Finally, I said the words that had been forming in the back of my mind since the moment I walked into the room. Why does he look like me? Linda didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the drawer again. This time she pulled out a thin folder. Medical records. Old ones. The top page had a date. August 17th, 1982. My birthday. She placed the paper gently in front of me. Because she said softly, you were born the same day. My throat tightened. That doesn't mean... But I stopped. Because suddenly everything in the room made a terrible kind of sense. The identical face. The letters. The weekly visits. My father's quiet life. Linda finished the sentence I couldn't say. You weren't an only child. Daniel met my eyes. And for the first time since I entered the room, his voice carried something deeper than curiosity. Something fragile. Sarah, he said quietly. I'm your brother. I didn't say anything for a long time. When someone tells you that the entire story of your life has been missing a chapter, your mind doesn't accept it right away. It pushes back. It searches for errors. There's been a mistake, I finally said. My voice sounded calm, but I could hear the strain underneath it. I'm an only child. Daniel didn't argue. He just watched me the way someone watches a storm coming across an open field. Linda folded her hands in her lap. Your father made that decision, she said quietly. What decision? To raise you as one. My chest tightened. That's not how families work. Linda gave a sad little smile. Sometimes it is. Daniel shifted slightly in the bed. The movement seemed to cost him energy, but he kept his eyes on me. You should read the letter, he said. I looked down at the envelope still in my hand. The paper felt heavier than it should. The handwriting was unmistakable. Frank Mitchell had never written anything fancy. His letters were straight, practical, and careful like the man himself. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. I knew his voice so well that I could hear it in my head as I read. Sarah, if you're holding this letter, it means you finally came here. And if you came here, then I guess the truth found its way to you. I swallowed. You weren't supposed to learn this way. I wanted to tell you myself someday, but time has a funny way of getting ahead of us. My eyes moved slowly across the page. You weren't born alone. Across the room, Daniel lowered his eyes. You and your brother came into this world on the same morning, 10 minutes apart. I leaned back in the chair. 10 minutes. The letter continued. But things went wrong. Linda watched me carefully. Daniel was born with a condition the doctors couldn't fix. His brain didn't develop the same way yours did. They said he might not live long. My father had never talked about that day. Not once. Your mother couldn't handle it. There was a long pause in the letter, as if even my father had needed time to finish the thought. She left. I closed my eyes for a moment. That part wasn't new. But the reason behind it was, that left the three of us. One healthy baby girl. One very sick little boy. And one mechanic who had no idea what he was doing. Daniel gave a faint smile when I reached that line. He used to say that all the time, he said. I looked at him. You remember? Oh yeah, he said softly. He said it every Saturday. Every Saturday. For 40 years. I looked back down at the page. The doctor said Daniel would need constant care, specialists, therapy, equipment I couldn't even pronounce. I did the math one night at the kitchen table. There wasn't enough money. The room was quiet except for the heart monitor beside Daniel's bed. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I knew what the next line was going to say before I even read it. I decided one of my children deserved a normal life. My throat tightened. You. The word sat on the page like a weight. I found a long-term care program here in Cleveland. The doctors said they could give Daniel the attention he needed. But it meant I couldn't raise you both the same way. I could almost see him writing the next lines late at night under the kitchen light. So I made a promise. I would raise you strong. And I would never abandon your brother. Daniel looked down at his hands. Linda quietly wiped the corner of one eye. I continued reading. I visited him every week. Sometimes more when I could. But I never told you. My chest tightened. Because I wanted you to grow up without guilt. Without feeling like half your life belonged to someone else. I wanted you free enough to chase your dreams. The words blurred for a second before I blinked them clear. When you told me you were joining the Marines, I knew I had made the right decision. Across the room, Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. He was really proud of that. I didn't trust myself to speak. The letter continued. You became the brave one. But Daniel became the patient one. I looked up. Daniel was watching me carefully. Not with anger. Not with jealousy. Just curiosity. Like he had been waiting his entire life for this moment. I finished the letter. If I'm gone when you read this, please understand something. I never loved one of you more than the other. I just loved you differently. The final lines were written slightly heavier, as if the pen had pressed harder against the paper. Half of what I leave behind is for Daniel's care. The other half is for the daughter who carried our name into the world. Take care of each other. Dad. The room stayed quiet after I finished. I folded the letter carefully and set it on my lap. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, I looked at Daniel. You knew about me? He nodded. All my life. And you never tried to find me? He shrugged gently. Dad said you were busy saving the world. Despite everything, I let out a small breath of laughter. You believed that? Sure. He smiled faintly. Still do. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. All the anger I had carried on the drive to Cleveland felt different now. Not gone, but complicated. Because the man I had come here to confront was my brother. The room stayed quiet after I finished the letter. No one rushed to fill the silence. Outside the window, late afternoon light fell across the parking lot, long shadows stretching across the pavement. I watched a nurse push a cart down the hallway through the glass door, moving slowly the way people move in places where time doesn't rush. For 40 years, my father had lived a life I never knew existed. 40 years of Saturdays in this hospital. And I had spent most of those Saturdays somewhere else playing softball, studying for exams, later training on bases across the country. I rubbed my hands together slowly. So that's it, I said quietly. That's the big secret. Daniel tilted his head. You sound disappointed. I looked at him. Honestly, I said. Yeah. I don't know what I feel yet. That was the truth. Anger had carried me all the way to Cleveland. It had been clean, simple fuel. But now the anger had nowhere clear to land. Because the villain I had imagined on the drive here didn't exist. Instead, there was just this man in a hospital bed who looked like me. Linda stood and walked to the small coffee machine in the corner. You two probably have a lot to talk about, she said gently. She poured coffee into 2 paper cups and handed one to me. I took it automatically. The smell reminded me of my father's kitchen in the mornings. Strong, bitter, reliable. Daniel watched me carefully. You're a Marine, he said. Yeah. Dad used to bring pictures. That surprised me. What pictures? He smiled faintly. Graduation, your uniform, one of you standing in front of a helicopter. I tried to remember. That was Afghanistan. He showed it to everyone on this floor. Linda laughed softly from across the room. That's true, she said. We all knew who you were. I stared at her. You knew about me. Of course, she said. Frank talked about you constantly. Daniel nodded. He called you his tough kid. My throat tightened a little. My father had never used many words with me. But apparently he had used plenty here. I took a slow sip of the coffee. What about you? I asked Daniel. What about me? What's your life been like? He shrugged lightly. Hospital rooms. Therapy. Doctors. He said it without bitterness. Just facts. I noticed a small television mounted on the wall beside the bed. Muted news played quietly on the screen. You ever get out of here? I asked. Sometimes, he said. They take me outside when the weather's nice. That's it. He smiled again. I've had a pretty good view of that maple tree out there for about 20 years. I followed his eyes toward the window. A tall maple tree stood near the parking lot, leaves turning orange in the fall air. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Because suddenly I realized something simple. While I had spent 40 years moving across the world, my brother had spent 40 years in this room. Linda pulled a chair closer. Your father did everything he could for Daniel, she said. I'm sure he did. No, she said gently. You don't understand yet. She reached into the drawer again and pulled out a small notebook. Worn leather cover. She handed it to me. Frank kept this. I opened it. The pages were filled with short entries. Dates. Times. Notes written in the same careful handwriting. Saturday, Daniel had a good day. Tuesday, speech therapy improving. April 12th brought him a baseball cap. Page after page. Week after week. Year after year. He had recorded every visit. Every change. Every small improvement. I flipped through dozens of pages before finally closing it. He never missed, Linda said quietly. 40 years. My father had never been the kind of man who talked about sacrifice. He simply lived it. Daniel spoke again. He also brought donuts. I blinked. What? Every Saturday, Daniel said. Glazed. Linda laughed. That part was very important. Despite everything, I smiled. My father had loved glazed donuts. Still, the old anger stirred again. But why hide this, I asked. Why lie to me for 40 years? Linda met my eyes. He didn't lie. He didn't tell the truth either. No, she admitted. Because he was afraid. Afraid of what? That you'd feel responsible. I looked down at the notebook again. My father had always been stubborn about protecting me from things. When I was 10, he had once fixed the roof himself during a storm rather than wake me. When I was 16, he worked 3 extra shifts to help pay for my first car. He had always believed burdens were something a father carried alone. Daniel shifted in the bed. He said something about you once. He said, What? That you needed to be free. Free from what? From us. The words hit harder than I expected. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the maple leaves moved in the wind. You know what's strange, I said after a moment. What? I drove here ready to fight someone. Daniel chuckled softly. Sorry to disappoint. I turned back toward him. No, I said quietly. You didn't. But something else had taken its place. Something quieter. Something heavier. Because now I understood the truth. My father hadn't betrayed me. He had simply carried a life I never saw. And suddenly I wondered about something else. Daniel, I said slowly. Yeah. What happens now? He shrugged gently. Now? Yeah. Well, he said, you found me. And Dad's gone. He looked toward the ceiling for a moment. Then back at me. I guess now we figure out how to be family. For a long time after Daniel said that, neither of us spoke. I guess now we figure out how to be family. The words hung quietly in the room. Family. It was a strange word to suddenly apply to a man I had met less than 2 hours ago. I walked back to the chair and sat down again. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. So I said slowly, you've known about me your whole life. Daniel nodded. Pretty much. And you were okay with that? He gave a small shrug. I didn't really have a choice. That's not what I mean. I know. He took a slow breath. Dad told me about you when I was little. Said I had a sister who lived a big life out there. He gestured vaguely toward the window. The outside world. And you never wanted to meet me. He smiled faintly. Oh, I wanted to. Then why didn't you? Because Dad asked me not to. The answer hit harder than I expected. Why? Daniel looked thoughtful. He said you needed to build your life without feeling like you had to take care of me. I leaned back in the chair. That sounds like him. Linda spoke gently from the corner. Frank worried about that a lot. About what? That you'd give up your dreams. I laughed quietly. My dreams involved the Marine Corps. That's not exactly a flexible career. Exactly, she said. Daniel watched me. He told me once that if you ever found out, it should be because you came looking. I looked at him. Well, I said, technically, I came here to yell at you. Daniel chuckled. That's fair. The humor helped a little, just enough to loosen the knot in my chest. Still something bothered me. Why the name Carter, I asked. Daniel nodded toward Linda. That was the hospital's idea, Linda explained. When Daniel entered the long-term care program, your father asked us to protect his privacy. Why? He didn't want anyone from town asking questions. Brookfield was the kind of place where people noticed everything. The thought of the gossip alone probably made my father nervous. So you gave him another name? Yes. I rubbed my temples. 40 years of secrets. 40 years of quiet decisions. What's your condition, I asked Daniel. He answered calmly. Cerebral palsy and some neurological complications. How bad? Well, he said with a half smile, I'm not exactly running marathons. But your mind's fine. Mostly. You read? All the time. Watch the news. Every day. Argue about politics with the nurses. Linda raised an eyebrow. Constantly. Daniel grinned. Occupational hazard of being stuck in one place. That made me smile again. But the heavier question still sat there. What about the future, I asked. What about it? Dad's gone. Daniel looked down at his hands. Yeah. The word was soft. I realized something then. I had lost my father 3 days ago. Daniel had lost him too. But Daniel had lost something else. The one person who had been coming through that hospital door every Saturday for 40 years. Linda spoke carefully. Frank made arrangements. What kind of arrangements? She pointed toward the letter still resting on my lap. Your inheritance. I understood. Half the estate wasn't a gift. It was care. It was rent for the rest of Daniel's life. Medical bills. Therapy. Specialists. My father had planned every dollar. I stood and walked slowly around the room. There were small signs of him everywhere now that I looked. A Cleveland Browns cap hanging on the wall. A toolbox-shaped cookie jar on the dresser. A framed photo of me in my Marine uniform. Dad brought that, Daniel said. I picked up the photo. He told you about my deployments. Every detail. What did he say? Daniel smiled. He said you were the bravest person he knew. My throat tightened again. He said that every week. I set the photo back down. Something inside me shifted right then. Because I realized something important. I had come to Cleveland believing my father had betrayed me. But the truth was harder to accept. He hadn't chosen between us. He had chosen both. And he had carried the cost alone. For 40 years. I turned back to Daniel. You know something? What? You and I have very different life stories. Daniel laughed softly. That might be the understatement of the century. But we have one thing in common. What's that? Dad. He nodded. Yeah. I looked around the room again. You said he never missed a Saturday. Not once. That sounds like a Marine. Daniel smiled. You think so? I know so. I walked back to the chair and sat down again. Then I said something I hadn't expected to say when I woke up that morning. So what do you like to do? Daniel blinked. What? For fun. He thought for a moment. I like baseball. That's convenient. Why? Because the Reds are playing tonight. His eyes lit up. You're serious. Very. Linda laughed. You might regret starting that conversation. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Are you staying long? I looked at him. Then at the window. Then back at him. I took 2 weeks of leave, I said. For the funeral. Daniel's smile grew wider. Well, he said. Looks like we've got some catching up to do. The first baseball game we watched together started quietly. It was a Friday night broadcast, the Cincinnati Reds playing the Cardinals. The television hung on the wall across from Daniel's bed, and Linda helped adjust the volume before leaving us alone. I pulled a chair closer. Daniel looked almost excited, like a kid who had been waiting for company. You follow baseball, he asked. Not closely, I admitted, but Dad loved it. Daniel nodded. He'd bring the scores every week. The announcer's voice filled the room softly. Outside, the sun had dropped behind the hospital buildings, and the parking lot lights flickered on one by one. For a while, we just watched the game. No heavy conversations. No questions about the past. Just the slow rhythm of baseball. Pitch. Swing. Crowd noise through the speakers. It felt strangely normal. And that's when it hit me. For 40 years, my father had probably sat in this exact chair doing the exact same thing. Watching games. Talking about nothing important. Just being present. I leaned back and folded my arms. You know, I said I thought I came here for revenge. Daniel looked at me. Revenge. Yeah. For the inheritance? Oh. He smiled gently. That makes sense. I thought someone had taken advantage of Dad. And now, I looked at him. Now I think he might have been the strongest man I ever knew. Daniel's eyes softened. He was. The Reds scored in the third inning. Daniel raised both arms slowly in celebration. See, he said, you bring good luck. I chuckled. Don't get used to it. We watched a few more innings before he spoke again. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why the Marines? It was a simple question. But the answer carried years inside it. My dad, I said. Daniel nodded. Figures. He never pushed me, I continued, but he always believed in doing something bigger than yourself. Daniel smiled faintly. Sounds familiar. I looked at him. You mean staying here all these years? Yeah. You ever resent it? He thought for a moment. Sometimes. That honesty caught my attention. But mostly, he added, I figured Dad had enough worry already. You protected him. Daniel shrugged. Family does that. That word again. Family. The game ended late in the evening. The Reds won. Daniel looked satisfied. Best night I've had in a while, he said. Linda came in to check on him. How are we doing in here? Reds won, Daniel said proudly. Well, that's a miracle already, she laughed. She checked the machines and then looked at me. You staying nearby tonight? I booked a small motel down the road. She nodded. You're welcome back anytime. I stood up and stretched. My body suddenly remembered the long drive and the emotional storm of the day. Daniel watched me. You coming back tomorrow? The question carried a quiet hope. I didn't hesitate. Yeah. His shoulders relaxed a little. Good. I walked toward the door, then stopped. Hey, Daniel. Yeah. What did Dad usually talk about before he left on Saturdays? Daniel smiled softly. He'd say the same thing every time. What was that? He mimicked my father's voice surprisingly well. Take care of your sister if she ever shows up. My chest tightened. He said that every week. I nodded slowly. Then I left the room. The hallway outside felt quieter now. Hospitals at night always have that feeling like the building itself is breathing slowly. Linda walked beside me toward the elevator. You handled today well, she said. I'm not sure about that. Most people would have run out the door. I thought about it. But you didn't. We reached the elevator. Before the doors opened, she said something else. Your father was worried about this moment. He was... Yes. Why? He thought you might hate him. That stopped me. Hate him. For keeping Daniel a secret. I shook my head slowly. No, I said. I don't hate him. Good. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. As they closed, I caught one last glimpse of the hallway leading back to Daniel's room. For 40 years, my father had walked down that hall every Saturday. Alone. Quietly. Carrying a secret that protected both of his children. I drove back to the motel under a sky full of Ohio stars. The road was empty the way rural highways get late at night. And somewhere during that drive, something inside me settled. I had come to Cleveland angry, looking for someone to blame. But instead I had found something else. A brother. And the quiet truth about the man who raised us both. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains of the motel room and woke me earlier than I expected. For a few seconds I forgot where I was. Then everything came back. My father's funeral, the will, the drive to Cleveland. And Daniel. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, listening to the hum of traffic on the highway outside. When you spend most of your life in the military, mornings usually begin with noise and urgency. But this morning felt slower. Quieter. Like the world was giving me time to think. I showered, grabbed a coffee from the diner next door, and drove back to St. Mary's. The hospital parking lot looked the same as yesterday, but something inside me had changed. Yesterday I had walked through those doors looking for a fight. Today I was walking in to see my brother. Linda spotted me almost immediately when I stepped onto the long-term care floor. "Well," she said with a small smile, "look who came back." I said I would. "Daniel's been watching the hallway since 7. I couldn't help smiling. He always this impatient. Only when he's excited. When I stepped into the room, Daniel looked up from the television. His face lit up. "You came back." "Morning to you too," I said. He laughed. "I didn't think Marines slept in." "We don't," I said, setting a paper bag on the table. "But we do bring donuts." His eyes widened. "Glazed." "Of course." He grinned like a kid. Dad always brought glazed. We ate breakfast slowly, talking about small things. Baseball. The weather. The Browns' chances this season. It felt simple. And that simplicity carried a quiet weight. Because my father had built 40 years of Saturdays out of moments exactly like this. After a while, Daniel grew thoughtful. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What was Dad like at home?" I leaned back in the chair. "That depends." "On what?" "How honest you want the answer." Daniel smiled. "Try me." I looked toward the window. "He worked a lot," I said. "Sometimes too much. But when he was home, he was steady." "How?" "He fixed things. Everything. Pretty much." I laughed softly. Cars, washing machines, broken fences. One time he rebuilt the neighbor's lawn tractor from scrap. Daniel chuckled. "That sounds right." "But the biggest thing he fixed," I added quietly, "was me." Daniel tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "When Mom left, I was angry for a long time." He nodded slowly. "I can imagine. But Dad never let that anger turn me into someone bitter." I paused. "He just kept showing up." Daniel smiled gently. "Yeah, that was his superpower." The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Daniel asked the question I knew would come eventually. "What happens now?" I didn't answer right away, because I had been thinking about that all morning. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the same maple tree swayed in the breeze. "You know," I said slowly, "I spent 20 years in the Marines." Daniel nodded. "Dad told me." "I've been stationed in 5 states and 3 countries. That's a lot of moving." "It is." I turned back toward him. "But the truth is, the Marines also teach you something important." "What's that?" "You never leave family behind." Daniel's expression softened. "You're not saying what I think you're saying, are you?" I smiled. "I'm taking an early retirement." His eyes widened. "Wait, seriously?" "Seriously." "Because of me?" "Because of us." I walked back and sat down. Dad spent 40 years making sure we both had a future. Daniel's voice grew quieter. "You don't have to give up your life for me." "I'm not giving it up. I'm changing it." Linda appeared at the doorway again. "Everything okay in here?" I looked at her. "Actually, I have a question." "Go ahead." "Does this hospital ever take volunteers?" Her eyebrows lifted. "Are you serious?" "Very." Daniel stared at me. "You're moving to Cleveland." "I'm thinking about it." Linda laughed softly. "Well, Frank Mitchell would be smiling pretty big right now." Daniel rubbed his eyes. "You're going to make me cry." "Don't," I said. "You'll ruin my reputation." He laughed. Later that afternoon, we visited the small cemetery where my father had been buried. It sat on a quiet hill outside Brookfield, surrounded by cornfields and old oak trees. The wind moved gently through the grass. I stood beside the headstone for a long time. Daniel sat in a wheelchair beside me. Neither of us spoke right away. Finally, I said quietly, "You know, I thought Dad made a mistake." Daniel looked up. "What kind of mistake?" "Leaving half his fortune to someone I didn't know." Daniel smiled softly. "But now you know." I nodded. "Yeah." I placed 2 small Marine Corps challenge coins at the base of the headstone. "One for me." "One for Daniel." "My father didn't betray me," I said quietly. "He trusted me." Daniel looked at the coins. "He'd like that." I took a slow breath. Then I turned slightly toward the camera in my mind, toward the people listening to this story. Because sometimes stories like this carry a lesson worth sharing. If you've ever judged someone before knowing their whole story, maybe take a moment to look deeper. If someone in your family carries a burden you don't understand, maybe ask a few more questions before anger takes over. And if you've ever had someone in your life who showed up quietly week after week, don't wait until they're gone to realize what that meant. Families aren't perfect, but sometimes love works quietly behind the scenes, just like my father did. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone who sacrificed more than they ever said, then share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because the world could use a few more stories about forgiveness and about second chances.